to the built and natural environment of Barbados is one of the most significant of import to them. The issue of employment, we've heard that only 10% of people with disabilities in this country, adults with disabilities, are employed. And that is obviously a serious issue of which no country can be proud of. The reality is that globally, 80% of people with disabilities, it is estimated, are unemployed or not employed in terms of self-employment. So we have a lot of work to do in this area. They also mentioned education and obviously health, because the health of a nation is the wealth of the nation. And I noted with commendation, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in his inimicable way, and let me put it that way, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition mentioned the concept of affirmative action. And he spoke about it in terms of the American situation and what the Supreme Court inexplicably in America has now done in terms of removing affirmative action, which helped a vulnerable sector of their population, black people, for the last 60 years, better themselves in terms of their social and economic standing, and have now cut that down. And he spoke of affirmative action, and therefore, I took that to mean that the opposition party will join with this government in its concept of affirmative action for people with disabilities. This is a concept that we are preaching and which will be in the draft, which is in the draft legislation, let me put it that way, on rights of persons with disabilities, because we believe that people with disabilities are so far behind and need the help of affirmative action. In other words, if there are two people of equal merit and qualification who have applied for a job, one with disabilities, one without disabilities, that the person with disabilities should get the job. If not, as the Honourable Minister for People Empowerment said, you can't address in any significant way the fact that only 10% of adult people with disabilities in this country have a job or are in sustainable self-employment. You need that kind of concept, that kind of transformation, reformation, to really assist people with disabilities in terms of employment. And I took tremendous note of what the Leader of the Opposition said, essentially agreeing to that concept, which this government is of similar mind and ilk. But before we can reach people with disabilities being employed, we have to go to education. And part of course, the educational transformation that the Ministry of Education is proceeding to right now is how to uplift people with disabilities in terms of education. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the fact of the matter is, even though we have had on our legislation an education from the time they had an Education Act of 1962, I think it was 1961, maybe December came into force in 1962. Quote unquote free education at source, paid for by the taxpayers of this country. And even going back before that in the 1950s, we had 4 secondary schools where education was free. And of course, the grammar schools, the old grammar schools, once you did well, they were free too. But the reality of the situation, and we heard on a nightly basis, as the Honourable Minister for People's Empowerment said, parents come and talk about the challenges of getting a proper education for their children with disabilities. In one case, one mother said she had to switch schools 9 times. Another one said 10 times. And before the child reached 16 in trying to find a proper school for her child. And they got to pay. So I have a situation where people who are, in many cases, vulnerable financially already, and then they have a child with a disability, and then they got to pay for that child to go to school at a private institution which can cater to their special needs. In a lot of cases, the Ministry of Education pays a subsidy for that child's education, a bursary. In a lot of cases, the Maria Holder Trust, the Sandy Lane Trust, pays a subsidy for the education, like the school in just half mile from here in Perry Gap, off of Robert Street, paid for by Sandy Lane Trust, in a lot of cases, the students, but it is not a full subsidy. Parents still have to look for some funds. And in addition, because of the peculiarities of the disability, the parent has to pay for transportation for that child to go to school. So therefore, traditionally, there's been a high level of absenteeism from school because the parents can't afford to pay the transportation every day to go to, let's say, the Chandler School, which, as you well know, ma'am, in your constituency, is not a half mile down the road from where a lot of people, a lot of children with disabilities live. So these are now the daily reality of persons with disabilities and their parents and their caretakers. And this is what this policy seeks to address. We have not reached the mountaintop. We have not come here today to say that everything is now fine and dandy with people with disabilities. Rome was not built a day. But by what we are doing today and by what we propose to do before the end of this year with the Rights of Persons with Disabilities bill, we have gone a significant way further up the mountaintop than we were 3 years ago. So the issue of access to the built environment, access to transportation, and the Ministry of Public Works, Transportation, as we know, in our first term of office, brought in 59 electric buses, all of which have facility for persons who are mobility challenged. First time in the history of Barbados that has been done. We have made it a point to try and get better access for people with disabilities in terms of the built environment. So I believe that all buildings for which the public has access to under town planning legislation and regulations, conditions must have access for persons with disabilities. All new buildings. Of course, though, that leaves the buildings that are there now, and in a lot of cases, let's face fact, there's a difficulty. And under the draft legislation, owners of these buildings, operators of them, will be given time to retrofit these buildings, because it can't be that a person with disabilities can't get in a building that the public is invited into. I mean, they're not aliens. They're normal human beings. And you can see from this the input of the thrust of the government of Barbados, initiated by the committee, that you go to cultural events now, botanical gardens, for instance, and you see more people with disabilities there than ever before. People, mobility challenged, blind people, because, as has been said in here by both the Honourable Minister and by the Leader of the Opposition, days were not long gone where persons with disabilities, children with disabilities were hid in the back room of their house. When you visit the house, you can't see them. Like if the parents were ashamed Like if the parents felt that it was their curse, that they did something wrong, that they bore a child with disabilities. And the days of that have to be gone. Have to be gone. It's nothing to be ashamed of. So it was a pleasure, for example, seeing the concerted effort by the Ministry of Culture within the last year to include persons with disabilities in national cultural events. When the monument to Barbados, just a stone's throw from here, was unveiled in National Heroes Square last year. I think it was late last year, and they had a cultural show. They had 4 acts, including persons with disabilities, for instance, and this has to be so, must be so. They have to be included. The policy also speaks towards adequate standard of living and social protection for persons with disabilities, and the initiative by the Honourable Prime Minister in her capacity as Minister of Finance in her presentation of her budget and financial statements in March this year, to bring into effect a reformed social security system for persons with disabilities, as was mentioned by the Honourable Minister earlier today, whereby now the categories of persons with disabilities who, as of right, will get a non-contributory pension has been tremendously widened from the beginning of this month. And that has been something that we in the persons with disabilities and advocates like myself, I have been in this field for 35 years, have been calling for years, because since 1967, when the National Insurance Scheme Act came into force, it was only blind persons and deaf persons without speech who got a benefit as of right from our social security system. So if you were, for example, you became deaf when you were a teenager because you fell down out of a tree, let's say, and you became deaf. So in other words, you could speak because for 15 years almost you were speaking. You couldn't get a benefit. You had to be deaf without speech. So that has been widened now. And not only them, but children with all these disabilities too, now getting. It is a start. Of course, as the Honourable Member for St. Michael South said, there are categories that don't fall into the categories that of persons who now will get security or who are now getting social security. For example, 2 days ago or yesterday, somebody called me describing this particular disability which doesn't fall in exactitude with any of the 4 categories that have now been widened. But it's a start. And we realized that there was a lacuna in it. We only realized that this month after people started to get benefits that, and if we had thought about it, then that certainly the intention must be to also include those children of the blind, those children who are blind and who, when I say children, minors, who are blind and who are deaf without speech, within the categories of persons who will get the 50% benefit of non-contributory pension as of right. And the Honourable Member for Christchurch East Central intends to speak in this debate, and he will speak further on that issue when he speaks. Awareness building is certainly a factor in the issue. As has been said, we have to make people of Barbados more sensitive and aware of the plight of persons with disabilities. So that, for example, as has been said, and as the Honourable Leader of the Opposition also raised, in addition to the Honourable Minister, the issue of parking in car park spaces reserved for persons with disabilities. I know that in last year's debate in the other place on the financial statements and budgetary proposals, an independent senator said that if they gave her money, she would give up her law practice and go about Barbados to fine everybody who parks illegally in a car park reserved for persons with disabilities, that she felt so strongly about it because she herself has mobility challenges. And the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister has before her, and I think it has been referred to finance for comments before it is brought as an amendment to the legislation. And it's to increase that fine, because it's only $500 now. So somebody might say, man, I care about $500, man, I only $5 Grantley's, man, if they fine me, man, I don't care, let me park in the spot. And when you tell them something, won't tell you about your mother and yourself, that things you don't know. So the fine has to go up. It has to become a fine that befits the offense. And it has to be enforced, because that is another problem. We have to find a way to enforce this against these whatless people. As the Honourable Senator said last year, these whatless, no-carers people. Because it's a serious issue. We have, as I said, education and training, lifelong learning, and the Ministry of Education within its education transformation, and as it pertains to special needs and children with disabilities, is speaking about having particular educational individual development plans for each child going to school, so that the training and education given to them can be tailored towards their special needs and their disability. And that is important. There has to be a national register detailing the skills and qualifications of persons with disabilities, so that an employer could go to this register, can call National Disabilities Unit, can call the Council for the Disabled, and get a list of persons who can qualify and merit the job, because people with disabilities are not asking for tokenism. They are not asking to be handed a job which they're not qualified to do. What they're asking for is to be given an opportunity, because there are many people with disabilities who have graduated from the University of the West Indies, from BCC, many who have technical and vocational skills. And as God is a witness, those employers who give people with disabilities an opportunity realize and say that the better workers than people without disabilities. When we met with private sector, there were employers who said, man, you know, I was a bit reluctant at first to give this person with a disability this job, but believe you me, after a few months, I thank my God I gave them a job, that they were more productive than his other employers, because they're not on a cell phone, surfing the net all day. They're not on Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp. They're grateful that they have been given an opportunity to do the job, and they want to prove themselves, and they're doing the work. That is the reality. So we're calling on employers again, as we have done on many occasions, to give people with disabilities an opportunity for work. And if you have to retrofit your place, as is in the draft bill, you know, we will see how it can be done. In a lot of cases, it can be done without much expense. And again, the Leader of the Opposition, Honourable Leader, spoke to that in consensus with us here today, that you can't put money towards everything. Everything can't be looked at in dollars and cents. It's the progress of a nation, to the psyche of a nation, the overall view of a nation, because as Mahatma Gandhi said, a nation has to be judged by how it treats its most vulnerable people. Therefore, we have to be judged by how we treat towards people with disabilities. And it can't, all employers can't be heard to say, well, it's too much money now to retrofit the place. We will make adjustments. COVID has taught us that you could work from home some days, so that if it's difficult for the person with disabilities to come to work 5 days a week, they could work from home three days a week, 2 days a week, and perhaps be more productive than if they came to work. So we have to find a way to make this policy work in terms of its implementation. Persons with disabilities are entitled to quality education just like everyone else. So it means that teaching aids and equipment and devices have to be made available to them for them to maximize their potential and obtain lifelong learning and training and development like everybody else. As I said, the employment is a factor, and within the draft legislation, of course, there's a quota system for government to employ persons with disabilities, and this would not be unique. It is so in many European countries. It is so in Jamaica. In fact, Jamaica had a policy since 1999, because that's when Jamaica got a disabilities policy. They got the law in 2018. It was proclaimed last year, Valentine's Day. And Jamaica had a 4% quota system for employment of persons with disabilities in government and state-run institutions. Is now 5%. And a concerted effort being made to train persons with disabilities so that they can take these jobs. The private sector has to throw in its weight, because government can't do everything. Everything can't be on government. The private sector has to throw in its weight to assist in this regard as well. Healthcare speaks for itself. No need to go into that. I mean, the healthcare for a person with disabilities is, on average, is clearly more than it is for someone without. And issues even of children who have autism and having to pay $600 or $700 to be given an anesthetist to quiet them down before they can get dental treatment. These are the challenges that people with children with disabilities, that people with disabilities face. And we heard, for example, during the meetings that a deaf person may be at a polyclinic waiting to be treated, and no one realizes, those in authority, that he or she is deaf, and they call the name, the person sitting down there. Obviously, they can't hear the name, and they're going on, and they're waiting there, and the name call. So more people in the customer service arena, in the public sector and private, have to be trained to understand how to relate to people with disabilities. We need more people trained in sign language. And, you know, I confess, it's only now I formally learn in sign language. I formally take in sign language classes with Miss Bonnie Leonce, who is here helping interpret today. Every Saturday morning I go in there. Because, to be truthful, look, I've grown up with people with disabilities, and I found a way to communicate with the deaf from the time I was young. Everybody knows my sister is born deaf, who is here today. But I feel the need now to formally know it, to widen my knowledge of sign language. In fact, some countries, Guatemala, for instance, I think sign language is a second language, recognized, not a second language, recognized as an official language in Guatemala. In some countries, sign language is offered as a CXC. We have to come to this realization. The Honourable Member for St. Michael South spoke towards that he would like to see sign language one day in the near future offered as a CXC in Barbados. Access to justice, legal recognition, and this is a tremendous area as well. And we commend Professor Velma Houghton, who carried out a study on access to justice throughout the whole of CARICOM and produced a report on it. And this is another issue, because justice delayed is justice denied, and there's situations where persons, because they were blind and they couldn't sign a statement were denied justice in terms of being able to make a complaint to the police. That is a fact. And cases thrown out, rape cases and assault cases against, but by where persons with disabilities, women were raped and assaulted, that because they couldn't express themselves properly, or there was no corroborative evidence, cases thrown out. That's the kind of reality that we are talking about, and therefore, this policy document looks at how we can improve access to justice for persons with disabilities and legal recognition. The issue of protection in disasters and emergencies is key because, again, clearly persons with disabilities, especially those who live on their own, are most vulnerable in disasters and emergencies. And we as a government have tried both when I was Home Affairs Minister and the Honourable Member for Christchurch East, now Home Affairs Minister, focusing on how you could protect people with disabilities during the hurricane season if a hurricane comes in the next 3 days. And we have more facilities now, shelters, catering for persons with disabilities under those circumstances. It's a situation where, of course, we are awaiting the report of the Constitutional Reform Commission. And I know that that commission received memorandum that disabilities, the concept of disabilities should be recognized as a fundamental right which requires protection in our Constitution in the human rights section, just like how gender and religious freedom and are protected, and race and are protected from discrimination. So these are all issues which, on average, I suppose, the average person without disabilities who has never had to confront a person with disabilities within their home environment or their good friend doesn't address their mind. But the reality is, God forbid, anybody could get a disability at any time. That is why you should remain humble, or one of the reasons why you should remain humble and don't get too powerful, because in a whiff, your life can change. In a car accident or whatever. The report of the committee spoke about the laws that need reforming, and of course the Education Act needs to be reformed and is in the process of being reformed. He spoke about the Road Traffic Act needing reform, the Representation of the People's Act, because you have a situation now where, let's say a blind person goes to vote, which is their constitutional right. Every Barbadian has the right to vote and are encouraged to vote. Go to vote in an election. And just I mean, let me speak for my constituency. From the time I started to run, of course, focusing on people with disabilities voting, I tried to make sure that all the polling stations in my constituency were accessible to persons with disabilities. The frank truth is that the first time I ran, it was not so. Because when, and each of the 3 elections I ran, I hired vehicle that for persons with disabilities, mobility challenge, and blind. I personally took them to the polling station, went with them the first 2 times I ran. The last time I didn't, because I was otherwise assisting. And first time, had to help lift up those who were mobility challenged, had to help lift them up in the wheelchairs up some steps. Second and third time, made sure that wasn't so. The voting on ground level, don't have to go up any steps, have a special room for them, and if other people vote in there too, don't mind if A and B vote in there and they name Y, the voting in that room too. And got the Electoral Commission to agree. Because all of this now is a fetter on your right to vote, and we can't have that. We can't breach the Constitution that way. Blind persons, in some cases, we know in the past, the election officer there at the polling station used to say, well, I can cast the X for you. Well, how that could be right? Because the blind person don't know how that person voting, can't see. So it's things like that we have to reform. The Mental Health Act, and the Honourable Leader of the Opposition spoke about mental health, mental incapacity. Mental Health Act, Chapter 45 has to be reformed, and I know that the Law Reform Commission is looking at that. The issue of how you go about getting receivership through the courts, an expensive exercise where an individual now has dementia. And of course, as I said, recently in Parliament, we're looking at enjoying power of attorneys, where you have a power of attorney, you then get dementia, the power of attorney still continues to be operative. Unlike now, where as you get dementia, of course, the power of attorney you have is no longer applicable. Community Legal Services Act, we have proposed that you widen the mandate of the Community Legal Services Department so that persons with disabilities would be able to access community legal services in situations where right now they can't. And so we also spoke about the difficulties with the insurance companies, because a lot of people with disabilities speak that they have difficulty acquiring insurance. A deaf person came before us at a town hall meeting and said she has a driver's license for 14 years and can't get insurance up to now. Driving properly, never met in an accident, still can't get insurance. So we have scheduled another meeting with the insurance companies soon, because we all have to be on board on this. It can't be for the insurance companies to be making a whole set of money and you're depriving some people of insurance. But the insurance companies say all is well and good. But the fact of the matter is, too many people with disabilities say, even if they get an insurance, that they got to pay such a high premium for it over and above what someone without disabilities pays. That makes it just too difficult to obtain. So that gap has to be closed. The banking and financial institutions, we met with them more than once too, because again, too many complaints that you can't access the ATMs if you're mobility challenged, and therefore you got to go in the bank to do your financial transactions, and when you do that, you pay an over-the-counter fee. Or because you're blind, somebody in the bank tells you got to bring a relative, and you as an individual entitled to independent living, you may not want your mother or your son or your aunt to know your financial business, because you got a right to privacy of your financial business, but they tell you bring a relative because you're blind. And you're more intelligent than the person who telling you that. So these are everyday issues that are confronted by people with disabilities in this country that we have to work towards. As I said, it's not going to be changed overnight. It might take 7 years. A couple of things may not be achieved in my lifetime, but believe you me, I feel proud to be part of a government that is today doing what it is doing. In March 2015, during the month for the disabled, I brought a resolution as an opposition member of Parliament to this Parliament, calling for Parliament to have this debate and to agree in principle to, within 6 months, try and at least start the process of bringing legislation, disabilities legislation, to this Parliament, and the resolution was ignored. for the balance of that term. In other words, for another 3 years till Parliament dissolved itself, because the then Prime Minister didn't call an election. And Parliament dissolved itself and he had to call an election. So this is where we're at. As I said, there's no political divide on it, but it can't be denied whatsoever that this government, within the last 3 years, has done more by far than any previous administration, BLP or DLP, for people with disabilities. I just want to quickly go through some areas of practical initiatives by this government in the almost 6.5 years it has been in office. We created a recreational and rehabilitative facility for persons with disabilities at the National Disabilities Unit. Cabinet approved, and the Ministry of Housing is effecting a policy whereby 10% of state housing or state-assisted housing in the future is allocated to persons with disabilities, and the Honourable Member for St. George South, when he speaks, I'm sure will address that even further. Persons with disabilities are recipients of state trust loans for entrepreneurial ventures, and when the Honourable Member for St. George South again was Minister for Business and Entrepreneurship, he would tell you that the first person to receive such a trust loan was a person with disabilities. Parliament approved policy whereby persons with disabilities, and I think that was in 2020, whereby persons with disabilities together with residents in the particular community engage in at least 5% of state infrastructural developments in any district. So you're doing a project in a district, you're mandated to employ 5% of the persons at least have to be a person with disability or a person from that district. The parking spaces in Bridgetown, 4 or 5 parking bays in Bridgetown that came into effect in May 2022, something that the people with disabilities, the community, went as far as getting a petition signed with about 13,000 signatures. I was one in 2015, and taking it up to the government buildings there in Bay Street and presenting it to the then Prime Minister. And nothing was done in those 7 years until 2022, when the Honourable Deputy Prime Minister became Minister of Public Works, Transport. We went down there in Bridgetown and had a ceremony to give 4 or 5 parking spaces to people with disability, for people with disabilities and vehicles that are traveling in to park. So Chris Jukes, can't recognize strangers, but who is here, I believe he was the first person to park in the spot. The Barbados is signatory to the Marrakesh Treaty in February 2023. Under that treaty, and that's very important to blind persons, permits the adaptation of published works to be accessible to the blind. In other words, it gets around copyright legislation, where you can, adapt material, written material, as an exception to the blind, and you won't be breaching copyright law. 131 ramps constructed at homes, persons experiencing mobility challenges through the National Disabilities Unit, 400 wheelchairs and other assistive devices given through the National Disabilities Unit, 100 prostheses to people in need of them through the National Disabilities Unit. Every year for about, I think the last 3 years since COVID ended, Camp Reach, hosted by the National Disabilities Unit in collaboration with the Ministry of Youth Affairs and Community Empowerment, 70 children with special needs going to these summer camps. Greater transportation for 75 persons with disabilities to medical appointments. Like I said, this is a bugbear, because you don't have money anyway, and otherwise you have to pay $200 in many cases for transportation to your medical appointment and back if you don't have anybody to take you. The subventions to the organizations has increased by $1.15 million through the Ministry of People's Empowerment. 8 organizations serving people with disabilities. And in fact, the general total subventions given to organizations serving people with disabilities within the last 2 or 3 years has increased by 40% across the board. Information technology training to persons with disabilities, visually impaired persons through the National Disabilities Unit, hosting of entrepreneurial markets to give persons with disabilities the opportunity to make some money and to increase the skills in entrepreneurship, and symposiums on entrepreneurship by the Ministry of People Empowerment in conjunction with the Ministry of Business. The Ministry of Education, as I said, we have a far way to go still in education, but we've made a start because the Ministry of Education has prioritized persons with disabilities in taking courses in artificial intelligence and in digital programming and in related training. And some persons with disabilities have already received employment through that means. And the ministry has adopted a policy whereby especially teachers trained in special needs will now treat and teach children who need special needs, because you have a lot of teachers in the system who are qualified in special needs education, but not teaching children with special needs or disabilities. And I think there's now a policy to try and remedy that. The recent decision by the Minister of Education, the Honourable Minister, to reopen Alma Parish School is not without tremendous significance, ma'am. And you, especially, Madam Deputy Speaker, has to take some commendation for that, because you were advocating from the time it was closed in 2017, when we were in opposition. You were an opposition MP, you were saying, but that is madness to close that. The Alma Parish School needs to reopen. And now we have the commitment that it'll be reopening, I think, early next year. And we could go on and on in terms of the offer of national development scholarships for the last 2 years in speech therapy and in audiology, issues where there is a shortage of needs of those specialties in this country. So we only have, I think, 1 speech therapist within the government, and therefore some people with autistic disability and who are deaf have to wait, in many cases, a year or more for an appointment for speech therapy. So these are all issues where this government has made bold initiatives within the last 6.5 years to redress what is definitely an imbalance in terms against persons with disabilities. In my last 5 minutes, I would try to wrap up and to address the issue of the Disabilities Bill, which will form a tribunal where complaints by persons with disabilities, where they are complaining that they're being discriminated against, will be heard. And that tribunal will be very important, and the commission as well. The issue as well has to be, when we met as a committee with each of the ministries, we asked the ministers, look, would you agree in principle to have a person with disabilities on any statutory board or any state committee or school board that is under your ministry? And invariably they said, yes, look, yes, we will make an effort to appoint more people with disabilities on merit to be part of the governance structure in this country. And yes, that has been done to some extent. Sometimes I get calls from various ministers to say, Eddie, who you will recommend to put on this or that. And especially on committees such as infrastructural planning committees, because a person with disabilities should be on that committee to be able to tell the planning department, but look, you know, this elevator should be in Braille. So you have some government departments like and buildings like at Baobab Towers that have Braille in the elevators. But some that have been built within the last 10 years, they don't have Braille. So issues like that, you need input from persons with disabilities. These persons with disabilities need to be included in every aspect of this country. The issue is that, look, let me speak, if you bear with me, ma'am, for 2 minutes on my personal position. My sister is born deaf. I was 5 years old when she was born. I went to school at what was then the New Primary School, now the Wilkie Commonwealth School, in the same compound as the Irving Wilson School. It was called the School for the Deaf then. That school was established in 1967. So in other words, I grew up with a deaf person. Not only grew up with a deaf person, but went to primary school with deaf people. And at lunchtime, we used to play together. We used to run boat together, run races. So the deaf, of course, couldn't hear, but you will have somebody down there and to put up the hands so the deaf see them, and you know to start running the race. So I vowed from the time I was young that my life's role must be, if anything else, public life, to help and move and make life better for people with disabilities in this country. I am proud to have been given the opportunity by Cabinet and by my parliamentary colleagues full reign to do just that. And this is a significant day in my life as well, to be able to see us reach here. As I said, we haven't reached the mountaintop. We have to bring the legislation as well to give persons with disabilities legislative rights that they can take to court. But again, I commend the Cabinet and the Minister of People Empowerment and everyone else who has brought us this far as we endeavor to try to redress the inherent imbalances in our society towards people with disabilities and to give them full potential and opportunity to develop as equal citizens of this country. It has to be continuous education of our people in terms of sensitizing them and everybody playing a role in making life better for people with disabilities. So there has to be a continuous public relations campaign on the issue. But we have come far, and I'm proud of the League of Young Socialists of Barbados Labour Party, who 2 weekends ago at our conference successfully brought a resolution to conference which essentially mandates the party to look to see how caregivers of persons with disabilities who, because they're looking after the person with disabilities, their children or whatever, can't work, how they too could get some financial subsistence from government in terms of financial security, and that's very important. So, look, we've started the process already in terms, as I said, this month, reforming the social security system. It is not the be-all and end-all. I'm sure next year, as the Honourable Minister for People's Empowerment said, he said in his estimates, he's proposing a bit more. And we look forward to the Ministry of Finance agreeing to that. look, the basket is small, and there's a lot of pressure on a government to try to please everyone. What are the priorities? All sectors coming at you for more money for relief. But clearly there's been a recognition by this government that persons with disabilities are among the most vulnerable people, and that funds have to be spent to try to increase their position. Because if that isn't done, we as a country will suffer, because there's no use, for example, having our social security system, having to pay for, let's say, someone who was working in the public service, intelligent, but you're meeting an accident, so your back break up or your legs injured, and after a year, medically boarding you, and you have to go on disability benefits, which can't sustain you because there's only 50% or so of where you were working, but you're still intellectually capable of working. I've never understood that. So we have to find a way, both in government and private sector, whereby such a person can still continue to be employed, rather than having to be a recipient of disabilities benefit, again, a drain on our social security system, rather than someone who is advancing the development of our country by continuing to work. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank you for giving me, more time by the standing orders being waived. And, I look forward to joining not only with fellow parliamentarians, but the whole of Barbados in getting the realization of this policy document. And when the law comes, the implementation of the law. I'm obliged to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Member. Vice Church. East Central.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to second and fully support the comments by the member for St. James North, and also the presentation by my neighbor, the member for St. Michael South, who led this debate today. As I listened to the member for St. James North, I found myself listening as a parent, as a minister, as a member of government at various points in his presentation. And it is often important to understand the perspective that one wishes to share and the role that you will play in people's lives. This government has, from the very beginning, committed itself to protecting the most vulnerable in our society. A lot of what we have seen, certainly in the last 2 to 3 years, is as a result of the fact that we have done a significant amount of reform to bring greater discipline to the public finances, Madam Deputy Speaker. And notwithstanding the fact that we had to course correct, if you like, because of the impact of COVID-19, as well as the ash, the hurricane, and coming out of that successfully, we have maintained the discipline within the fiscal situation. The economy continues to grow. And therefore, we are indeed in a position now to focus on some of these areas that have been left wanting for too long. And the genesis of my contribution today, is really to share with the country that when we were originally looking at this area for an intervention, we first started looking at it from a tax policy perspective. But then we suddenly realized that, if we are going to indeed protect people, given all that we had seen in relation to how people relate to each other, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we needed to make sure that the individual's right was indeed protected. And therefore, we focused then on how do we put in this intervention, enshrine the benefit directly to the person with a disability as opposed to the parent for whom the care is being given. And I start there because, as the member for St. James North rightly said, if we are going to be a wholesome society, an inclusive society, Madam Deputy Speaker, then we must accept there are certain rights that all of us will have and share, and therefore be able to respect that right. And to the extent that whilst we accept that there are persons with disabilities who will not know that that right exists, consciously, as a society, it is our responsibility to ensure that those rights are protected and upheld. And I can say that as a parent, it is something that we often think about, because as you would appreciate, the vulnerability exists, Madam Deputy Speaker, such that if something happens to a parent, the first concern is what will happen to the care of their children. And we have, as a society, to understand that it is all of our responsibility to protect those who are most vulnerable, but that we work together with the organizations, with the various government agencies, to ensure that these rights that we are seeking to protect, and I'm speaking now specifically of the financial rights, because as you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, within families, you have conflict, and that conflict sometimes plays out in such a way that what you may refer to as typically developing children and just regular families end up in some level of dysfunction. In the case of persons with disabilities, we really can't afford to have such dysfunction play out in such a manner that the persons with disabilities are further disadvantaged, simply because they are not even aware of the fact that there's something for them, and consciously aware that there's something for them, and to be able to articulate what their choice may be in a particular situation. And therefore, these are not simple matters, because even with persons for whom have clear conscience, I've seen families completely go at each other. And these are people who have no mental or physical disability. It's just pure animosity for each other. And we do not want that, Madam Deputy Speaker, for persons with disabilities. And so, as we think about how do we further enhance the protections around the conferring of these benefits by the state to persons with disabilities, I want to say to you and to the country, through you, Madam Deputy Speaker, that as we are now seeing, even in the context of people applying to get the benefit on behalf of the person with disabilities that the Honourable Member have been given that the policy started on October 1st of this year, we've already had instances of both parents applying for the grant for the same child. And that is not something that one would think would be a normal thing. But again, if people are not communicating with each other for whatever reason, then obviously the NAS now has to figure out who to give the authority for the grant to be able to be disbursed. Because if it was in my case, for example, when my son does not speak, as you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, how would the NAS know whether to give me or my wife? And these are the things, Madam Deputy Speaker, that as a society, as government with its best intentions, through policy, are looking out for the people who are most vulnerable. There are still elements in the society that now have to resolve these things if the policy intent is to be met in real time to deliver on what it is supposed to deliver, Madam Deputy Speaker. And therefore, I can only urge Barbadians that in these matters, you must be able to set aside whatever relationship issues exist and focus solely, Madam Deputy Speaker, on how you are actually going to help the persons for whom this help is intended to provide. Persons with disabilities have a range of issues that they have to confront. And this should not be one of those areas that they're now confronted with simply because of some breakdown in the family. And I say that because as we are consciously trying to figure out how to better deliver care for people, at the end of the day, the care has to be delivered by somebody in the community. And with the best will in the world, we do not need this type of disharmony, if you like, within the context of being able to deliver this policy. Equally, I am very comfortable with where we have settled on the broad policy as it relates to people with disabilities. What my concern is how the rest of the society, whether they are public servants or persons in the wider society, how the people on the front line now are actively thinking about how they, every day, will look at how they are executing, whether it's government's policy or the private sector or wherever, how they are actively going to help improve on how we can actually improve the lives of people with disabilities. And to the extent that we have settled policy and it's being drafted into the legislation, at the end of the day, somebody has to go out there tomorrow or the day after the legislation is passed, and should start doing it already, in terms of how my department interacts with persons with disabilities. What can I do to change what we are doing? Because with the best will in the world, we can give the money. But if people are not vested, Madam Deputy Speaker, vested in trying to solve these problems in the areas for which they have the expertise, and to actually care about whether or not this thing happens, and to make it happen, then we will pass this resolution, we will pass the legislation, but then it is only if somebody calls and says, well, Minister, this ain't happened, that somebody has to call somebody now to make things happen. And therefore, I know that the committee has met broadly, but I hope that you continue to be as aggressive as you have been so far, because you cannot rest until this thing is the lived reality for every citizen in this country. And you have my full support in relation to that. As it relates to issues in relation to accessibility, and as we see here, the Parliament itself is not sufficiently equipped for persons with disabilities and certainly wheelchairs. And given that we have spatial issues, even the relook and redesign of Parliament itself really should be completed, given that any of us, Madam Deputy Speaker, or anybody that I see here could be elected as a member of Parliament and can come to this place, and therefore the Parliament itself should make sure that it is accessible. And we give our commitment to be able to remedy that, because it should just be normal for these things to be the case. A few weeks ago, we met with the National Disabilities Unit and the ministry, more broadly speaking, to look at how we were going to be implementing this new set of benefits. And I gave the commitment then that the NDU really should be developing a plan, the National Disabilities Unit should be developing a plan to be able to retrofit all of government's facilities over a 3-year period such that it ensures that accessibility is front and center in relation to how government is taking this responsibility very seriously. And therefore, I expect that when they present estimates in January, that there should be a plan that says these are the buildings that we're going to tackle first, and then work to ensure that those things are done, simply because if we are going to make this thing, so we're not waiting until legislation, as I hope the country would recognize we have not. We have been doing things along the way to make sure that we are not waiting for the perfect piece of legislation to then start doing things. And therefore, the NDU will be developing that plan that we will support to ensure that all of government's buildings over a 3-year period can be retrofitted, and to ensure then that persons with disabilities can traverse any government building, and with that in mind, be able then to ensure then that when it comes to areas in relation to work, as we've been trying to do through the support that the member for St. Peter has been doing with the First Jobs initiative, to be able to expand and give persons with disabilities working with the private sector support through that specific initiative, that we can ensure then that people actually have spaces that they can work safely. And the truth be told, Madam Deputy Speaker, as you know, all it really takes is for someone to trip badly and you become physically disabled. And therefore, accessibility, really and truly, Madam Deputy Speaker, in the way that we design stuff, really should be just be designed with these things in mind, rather than thinking that it is only for persons with physical disabilities. And I think that once we're able to get that in our heads, because there are times, sometimes, Madam Deputy Speaker, you know, walking up them steps there to come up here, don't be easy if you're tired, you got a little limp. It ain't easy. But we have to now relook how we view these things in order to make sure then that accessibility is front and center. Now, I know that we've done a number of resolutions here in Parliament. Earlier this year, we did the one with the Autism Association with respect to having the center, if you like, at the garrison for persons with autism as they get old, to be able to, older, I should say, to be able to support them with respect to life skills and the like. My son is 15 years old, Madam Deputy Speaker, will be 16 next Friday. And as you know, at 15, turning 16, you're in the midst of puberty. And one of the things that nobody talks about, they don't even talk about with normal, typically developing children, is what, because I can't help him, Madam Deputy Speaker, my wife can't help him, and therefore these are some of the issues that persons with disabilities certainly are concerned about. I know we've had debates in this Parliament about child protection, we've had debates on sexual offenses and these matters, but the reality of it is that outside of the physical or mental disability that may exist, persons with disabilities are active citizens like everybody else. And the reality of it is that nobody in any shape or fashion, and this is not this is not a criticism, this is just the way the society is. Nobody talks about these things. And I think we need to find ways to be able to help people to not just communicate, but how to deal with the result of these types of issues, because whether you're a typically developing child whom your parent is not educating you about puberty and sex and sexual reproduction, I have had conversations with my son. I do not know whether he understands anything that I've said to him, because he cannot communicate with me that whether he does or he doesn't. But we have, as a society, to be able to break these things down, because we will all be the better for it if we just took the time to have these conversations. I don't know where it will lead, but I know that not talking about it is not helping. And therefore, we need to be able to address that. Now, as it relates to more broadly how we are looking to further support, because I raised the issue of the life skills in the context that as children move into adulthood, you would appreciate that things change. And as things change, certainly the frustration, as I can attest, I can see in my son's behavior changes. And therefore, as parents, as caregivers, there is stress in respect to that. And therefore, the support that is offered, certainly by the associations and what have you, Madam Deputy Speaker, it really is invaluable, because nobody knows until you're in it. And therefore, I really commend all of the organizations, to be honest, all of them, because depending on which area, people who are able to share their experiences with one another, it's important that people do not feel as if they're alone. And the worst thing that I think you can feel in this life is if you are alone in the world. But I think as a group a very diverse community, that support is important, so that people know that there's always somebody that you can count on. And I think I want to just offer my applause for the wide range of associations who were represented here today, and really for volunteering to make sure that the fight is carried. And therefore, I think as a government, we are trying to respond as swiftly, as flexibly as we can, in order to make sure that we can address a number of these critical issues. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is one rung in the ladder, so to speak, in relation to how we can better deliver for persons with disabilities. And I know that whilst people will ask about why this and why that and what have you, the reality is that we have seen over the course of the last few years a significant increase in diagnoses with respect to autism, and it's globally, but certainly in Barbados. We have tried to make sure that we can anchor the support in the areas that we see in the greatest demand, and we will continue to review and reflect based on how we see not just the circumstances, but the need to be able to intervene. We shall do so. I did, the Honourable Member for St. James North, as we had discussed a few weeks ago, within the context of the existing policy, because when we were looking at this when was it? It was before the budget this year. When we were looking at this, the intervention was on the basis of the persons who were enrolled in the large enrollment in terms of persons within the primary and secondary school, based on what was presented to us. But what we will do is, with respect to children who are also deaf and blind, we will be adjusting the policy to equally include them with respect to the benefits that we have broadened, just to keep it consistent with what had already been in place. And therefore, we will expect that to be rolled out very shortly, and therefore, no discrimination in that respect would take place. Now, Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an evolving space. And I want to say to the Honourable Member for St. James North, government's overall policy really is to see how we can get every citizen, including those persons with disabilities, to fulfill their potential and to be in a position to be financially independent of government. And therefore, the programs and support that we have put in place to facilitate that, because I do not wish for people to think that the non-contributory benefit, which is $960, if I'm not mistaken, a month, that is not what we want people to be living on. It is a stipend is for support as an adult. But if we can get persons with disabilities through the skills upgrade in whatever area you may wish to participate and get them into work, Madam Deputy Speaker, like every other citizen, then that really is what our overall mission really is. And therefore, the interventions in respect to what the Honourable Member raised in terms of what we have been doing, whether it's the trust loans, whether it is the cybersecurity training, whether it's the artificial intelligence training, or any other training program that the government is rolling out, we want to encourage persons with disabilities to sign up. We want to encourage employers in this country to hire the people who you know will deliver for you. And notwithstanding the fact that if we have to legislate, and I know that with respect to the building code, the issues in relation to how we would regulate around that, but if we have to legislate that buildings are accessible, then we may have to do that. If we have to give an incentive, we might consider giving an incentive. But the reality is it is just the right thing to do. Because at the end of the day, Madam Deputy Speaker, when you're designing from inception, or if you have to retrofit, it makes more sense for you to be able to have more people coming to your business, engaging with your business, than not. Because if I can't get in the place comfortably, Madam Deputy Speaker, I ain't coming. And therefore, as we have seen, as government has tried to demonstrate, that this is a social investment in our people. And therefore, I want to say to the private sector, as I'm saying that government will undertake its own review of its assets, and over the next 3 years, Madam Deputy Speaker, through the work of the NDU, of course working in concert with the Ministry of Housing, but the NDU's focus is disabilities, and they're the ones who go around to private homes, as you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, dealing with the ramps and those types of things for people. We will let the NDU focus on how those retrofits will be required for government, let them execute that, and therefore allow our government facilities now to literally come up to mark in the shortest possible time in order to ensure that at least if any citizen with disabilities if you have to visit any government facility, that we know that you would be accommodated appropriately and not have to worry about whether or not you can get in or out of the place safely. That is the absolute minimum that we should be doing. The internal, the change management and mindset, that's what now we have to work on with the management of our departments to ensure that the right protocols are in place, the right communications are in place, and that you have the right people. The right people. And I say that for what it's worth, the right people to actually ensure that the policy is the lived experience of people in this country. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm fully supportive of this resolution today. I promise not to speak very long, but I felt it was important to share my perspective, as I said, as a minister, as a parent, as someone who has, and I declare for a conflict, because that's how things would be will be looked at these days, a good conflict of interest in this particular area, because if we as a society do not acknowledge that we have a responsibility individually and collectively to look out for our most vulnerable, then I don't know what it is we are doing every day if we are not able to do that. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm fully supportive of this resolution, and with those very few words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Member St. Philip North, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well appreciated. First of all, I want to welcome who is left of the invited guests. It is definitely an honor to have you here. And I hope the conversation today has served you well, with the hope and the trust in the government that we will do better for you. We are here, all of us, to acknowledge the presence of the large number of those with disabilities living on our island. As many who have spoken before me had said, we have to acknowledge that there are various disabilities, both mental and physical disabilities, which people often forget that it goes beyond the physical disability, whether it be blind, can't walk, issues like that. We also have to acknowledge that there are long-term as well as short-term disabilities. Many people focus on the long-term disabilities, whether you're born with them, whether you acquire them as childhood and they last lifelong, but there are other disabilities short-term. I may get in an accident. I may hurt my back, which I did for a whole year, struggling with a cane. So as the honourable member who presented, those who live it know it. And that opened my eyes a lot to what people with disabilities faced during that year. We also have to remember people with chronic diseases, the NCDs, the catchword over the last 2 years or so. Many of these people have both chronic as well as short-term disabilities. Some may have strokes, some may have chronic kidney disease requiring dialysis, which means they really can't work, most of them, because ideally it's a 3-day-a-week, almost the whole day that you're out from work. Autoimmune diseases, cataracts, glaucoma, all of these things are included. Mental health disability, people forget that depression and anxiety can really be debilitating. And I pause here to remember those who suffer from postnatal depression, women who have had babies that really cannot care for them because the depression is so severe that they're really not even able to go back to work, much less to care for the baby. And we have said repeatedly that the country is facing I don't want to say epidemic of those who are aging. Our population is aging rapidly, and we expect even more disabilities to come out of this. So we are well aware of what is going on. I want to just pick out a few areas to speak on that the other members have spoken on too. So forgive me if I appear repetitive. Transportation issues, and I'm happy with what the honourable member for St. Michael South had alluded to, it happened, increasing in the buses and so on for the disabled. I have had issues myself. I am not even sure if they're solved. If they're solved, it's because the children aged out. Where a member of my community was asked to walk something like 500 meters or a little more to the main road to be able to catch the disability bus. And all I tried, I could not get it changed. I had another member he was kicked off, for want of a better word, of the bus because there was no more room. And me and the Ministry of Health almost had it out. And it was resolved long after that. So these are the issues that I pray the increase in the buses and so on for transportation for the disabled are addressed post haste. The other thing, I agreed with the honourable member as well, who presented that the privately owned public service vehicles need to get on board, even if it is mandatory at some point, get on board with the transportation of the disabled. One of my other pet areas, education. And it goes beyond the obvious things like outfitting the schools where appropriate, ramps, access to bathroom facilities, proper access. It goes beyond that. We include as well the education of teachers, existing teachers and auxiliary staff, educating and informing on what the issues are with the disabled, and they include here children that are autistic, suffer from ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, just to have the current staff educated in terms of how to treat these children. And of course, encourage new teachers or members to the teaching profession to facilitate as well their training in the differently abled, special needs children. Because if I dare say, I would love to see something like this in every primary school on the island. It's a hard task, but the truth is it's needed. There are not enough special needs classes in our primary school. I recently had a student that we had a little bit of a tough time getting him into one of the special needs schools. The teachers at the present school really could not accommodate because they did not know how to treat how to treat to that disability. I just want to mention the Albert C. Graham Center that is under the Ministry of Health, which I always believe that the Ministry of Education needs to take a bigger part, and I think I heard something along those lines. The institution is overbooked. The waiting list is too long. Too long, and there are children that really need help more urgently than that. I am aware that the Ministry of Health have asked for the increase in the staff member for speech therapy and so on, but we need either another facility or the expansion of the current facility to accommodate these children, because in many cases you have to treat to the disability early to get some measure of improvement or maintenance, I should say, and waiting 5, 6, 7 years really does not cut it. So this is one of the things I want to speak of. But the other issues we have to deal with is educating parents on the disabilities. And maybe 2 members or 3 members mentioned parents with disabilities back in the day hid away their children. I know a few. I have a few patients, Down syndrome, for instance, and they're relatively high functioning. And if things were then what they are now, these people will have gainful employment. They'll be able to maybe work in shops, packing goods, even beyond that. And we missed that opportunity. Going forward, we need not miss that. We need to support parents. Oftentimes, I've seen the parents of autistic children reaching out to government, reaching out to private sector for help, whether it be finding information about the disease, having the disease diagnosed, have the disease treated, and it is extremely expensive. It's almost a disease, I would say, for the well-to-do. And the children, the families that do not have it are left behind. And we need to institute something in the public sector, something big in the public sector to aid many of these children that just do not have the wherewithal to deal with it. The testing, the diagnosis, the education, all of that is extremely expensive. Support for the parents when it comes to stress. It has been proven that those parents who have children with disabilities, autism, other disabilities, are some of the most highly stressed of all the parents that exist. That is documented fact. And with all the issues with mental health, which I admit the Ministry of Health, and I think the Ministry of Sports, but under the Honourable Member, we have hotlines and everything. We're trying to educate the public on mental health issues, but I think there needs to be a space carved out for these parents that suffer from stress and depression, specifically those people who have children with disabilities. Financial support. I feel like applauding for the government that have increased the financial support in terms of non-contributory pensions to those disabled. This is extremely important. And why I say so, over the last year, I had about 3 calls, one up to last week. The parent was actually irate. And I really can't blame her, because one had to now think of, and I'll bring in maybe health here or some other department, had to think of giving up her job so that she can maintain the child. And I bring in here, just to segue a little bit, Her child is now 18, and my concern is for those who have reached the threshold for education, at least free education. And that, of course, includes quote-unquote babysitting. And she's pulling out her hair, or was, to figure out where to put this child that she could continue her gainful employment. And this is something that I've been advocating for when it was in the Ministry of Health, where we speak a lot about the care of the elderly and families dropping off their elderly people for the hospital to keep where they can. Sometimes circumstances dictate such that they have no other choice, I must say so. Not most, but there's also the phenomenon of young fakir. These people generally have aging parents that have been looking after them for 20, 25, 30 years, well aware that they're closer to death than they were 20 years before that. And they have serious worry on what to do with their children after they have aged out of school, nowhere to put them, nobody at home to look after them. And this is where women always have that special place in my heart. Men don't, no offense to the gentlemen in here, but men don't have that, what's the word, drive, instinct. They obviously can be maternal.
Instinct.
But women tend to be the ones who would stay home with their children, whether they're adult children or not. Women tend to be the ones that have to find the money, and here bringing the court system. And this is something that has been going on for years, whether you have a disabled child or you don't have a disabled child, in terms of getting your money for the child support. And it's worse, because oftentimes, the father is the one who disappears after this child is found to be disabled or differently able, or however you choose to call it. The father disappears, you put them in court, you can't get the money. And if you do get money, sometimes it's way beyond what you need for a child to live. And the mother, regardless of if she's working or not, has to find the difference. That is the issue I have with the court system sometimes. Either you're embarrassed by waiting. I know people that they were in arrears for $11,000 at one point for lack of child support, and it becomes particularly important when it comes to parents of the disabled. And I just want to put that in there. So these are some of the issues with respect to health. I heard the Honourable Member for St. Michael South vocalizing a complaint from the disabled community where treatment at the hospital is sometimes less than stellar. I cannot disagree. In many instances, I have to disagree. He brought up the issue where people cannot communicate, but that I really don't accept that as an excuse. Doctors have been trained, and nurses, to be able to diagnose a patient whether they can vocalize or not. This is not an excuse for adequate treatment. The other thing that I'm seeing in the healthcare system, and this is not necessarily hospital, but I had a case lately in the hospital, where disabled people are thrown into a basket. So whatever they have, if they're unable to walk, if they show up at the hospital with pain, they're automatically put in the basket. Is your disability. Never mind a fracture could be there. If you have pain, they might treat it as depression. You have depression and psychosomatic symptoms, so they go no further. I recently had a patient who, and they call it a disability, is suffering from terminal cancer. Not much older than I am. Went to the hospital because he could not breathe. Nothing was done according to the patient. Before you get cussed too much, let me say that. According to the patient, beyond checking his oxygen level, and sent home because he has cancer and he is dying. When I saw him, there was no air entry in his chest. Heart failure, something that could be fixed even as an outpatient. So doctors and healthcare professionals have to be mindful, have to be sympathetic, have to be empathetic, have to be human when it comes to caring for the disabled. And I usually defend the medical profession, but not at this juncture. And it's not all of them, let me admit, it's a minority. So, I'm just checking my notes. So one of the things, and I'm not sure, the honorable member for St. Michael North might allude to it later when he speaks. One of the ideas we have, patient advocates, if they still exist at the hospital, is my humble submission that maybe specific patient advocates can be there that will address the concerns and actually advocate for the disabled, whether they can speak sign language, which needs to be on the curriculum in the primary schools. We bother with Spanish and all kind of things, which is fine, but we need to put sign language given the increase in the disabilities on the island. But have patient advocates that address the issues and advocate for those disabled. Patient advocates that actually have an ear and an understanding. And I say ear because oftentimes the patient advocates are trying to say, you're not medical, you don't know. And we don't need that. I have, and this is another bugbear of mine, we all know about diabetes and circulatory problems. We all know about the amputations on the island. In fact, we are known as the amputation capital, or at least were, of the world. However, we have individuals who have had amputations, whether it be diabetes, whatever, and have waited for ages to get prostheses. And I am aware that somebody somewhere in the hospital was trained by government to come back and do this service, and I'm deeply disappointed. Not only prosthetics, but other appliances for children. Thank God for Sandy Lane Trust, and they have my heart. They do a lot. Appliances for children who have been born with issues with their feet and so on. We bring in people from overseas, great. But we need to buttress what we can offer. We were known as the capital for health in the region, and we have slipped. My greatest wish is to see us go back, but we need to address these people with prostheses. People without prostheses, with amputations, can work. Gainful employment, nothing wrong with the brain. She's in her 30s, but she had the money, well, her boss paid for prostheses. She's back at work, functioning as usual. We are missing the workforce because of something as simple as a prosthetic device, which is a burden on the NIS because they're coming up with disability benefits. We are losing money on that front, and people want to work. Nobody that I know of in the disabled community wants to be on welfare. Not one. But members, anybody in here may correct me on that. We are missing out on the workforce by not seeing that these things are addressed. Cost is another issue, and I am aware that we as a government cannot fit the bill for everything. Cannot. But just be mindful that the cost, and other members brought it up, the cost of sometimes the treatment, diagnosis of some of these illnesses is extremely expensive. Multiple sclerosis, medication for that can run in the thousands per month. So sometimes a patient has to accept mediocre. Drug service helps sometimes. Things like hearing aids are expensive. Cancer treatment is extremely expensive. Cataract surgeries, just a little bit of it's not amusing, but it's quite interesting. Yesterday, a neighbor of mine came back from overseas, I'll tell you where, Guyana, and had her cataract surgeries done for $700 Barbados per eye. Barbados is seen in the private sector cataract removals anywhere between $4,000 and $5,000 per eye. I will continue to recommend that patients of mine should take a plane ticket and go overseas and across the sea, not too far, to have it done. Things like that, we need to be conscious that people need help. People cannot afford $5,000 an eye and eat at the same time. A lot of people, and I hate to say it, but unless you have money in Barbados, sometimes you, as the young, well, I don't know if this is still the young people phrase, sometimes you salt. But things like that are important. If the private sector, yes, you have to make a profit. I agree with that. If I work, I have to make a profit. But does the profit have to be hundreds of percentage points? I think not. Blindness and cataract is avoidable. In most cases, it can be corrected. That is the most reversible cause of blindness that we face. There is glaucoma. We have to, and the hospital has been doing a wonderful job in terms of educating people on glaucoma, the healthcare system on the whole. But these things, in the end, if people are not treated, that's loss of a workforce as well. Going blind from cataract is foolishness, unless there's a background of some of the illness. I'm happy with the subvention of 40% increase that the Honourable Member mentioned for those involved in the treatment, however, those with disabilities. Happy, happy, happy. But this is about this is another time I will use this occasion to advocate for organizations like Cancer Support Services. They do have a subvention, but the subvention is still way too small. When we think that these people help out with cancer, and that is a disability, whether it be end of life or not, help out with beds, wheelchair, oxygen, transportation, hospital beds, hospital sheets, hospital curtains, educating the medical staff, education of the public. If some of that 40%, and it might not be you, it might not be people in permanent health, and I pushed for this before, can be allocated to organizations, non-profit organizations like these. What I know about cancer, maybe 20%, 30%, I have learned from Cancer Support Services, and they have to be included. And then for I'm going nicely, short discussions, depending on the time. Things like sidewalks or lanes on the road, yes, for walking and for wheelchair access. Too many roads are being renovated without this access. There's a gentleman in my constituency that most days I see him with a wheelchair avoiding traffic for exercise. Avoiding traffic, nowhere else for him to go. That has an accident waiting to happen. I don't think his wheelchair has lights, but that's an accident waiting to happen. So something like that needs to be considered. The parking, I support it. I think there need to be further parking spaces. But I have a question, and this is generally a question. I know the long-term or lifelong disabled have the nice parking pass that you could put on your car. But I discovered when I had issues, if I park or if I took my mother, who at the time could barely walk, she really can't do much of it now. But for short-term people that have disability, I have the potential for being punished for moving up in a car space to get a little closer to the supermarket door. I am interested in what is in place, if anything at all, or what can be in place for people like that. Sometimes they have a broken leg. This is 6 weeks in a cast. Can't go too far. You don't necessarily, by the time you apply for the pass, you're better. What could be in place for something like that? Because if you leave your car, a police officer really doesn't know what's happening. And things like that, I don't think it happens overseas, but we have to bear in mind the short-term disability, the injuries, people like that in terms of parking. But I wholly support the fact that we have spaces for parking, and I wholly condemn those who park in these spots that should know better. Housing, wonderful initiative that 10%, is it? 10% of the houses going forward will go to the disabled. But bear in mind that the disabled will include those who have aged and can't walk. So apart from the noted, registered disabled, going forward in these housing units or whatever, to put things in place to accommodate those who 30 years from now would not be able to get up the steps without a ramp, need handrails, maybe things like that should be in place early, so you don't really have to go back and fix. Employment, totally agree with it in terms of more disabled people need to be in the workforce. Consider things like working from home. You don't need to deal with steps. Some employers actually so in love with seeing people in the workplaces. They're in love with it. But at the same time, I know one or two, well, one in particular, who has shut down, don't rent anymore, shut down, and everybody works from home. They may meet once a month, but everybody works from home. And oftentimes, people find it to be more productive if they work from home. So we need to reach out, and I think you have, reach out to employers, but at the same time, you need to focus on the issues that the employees have, their fears. I don't want to say issues, their fears. Because I could think that an employer might be fearful of sick leave, which I don't think most times is no more than regular people. People, they might have fear for sick leave or injury at work, if somebody is blind or whatever, or can't walk properly. So it might be helpful to address the fears, have a sit-down discussion of the employers that have issues with employing the disabled. And I really don't, I think at heart, most people, once they're clear and educated on the issues, really won't mind. Thank you. Really won't mind. And I ask things like care leave. I'm not going to call myself, and nobody not locking me up, but many times I have parents, not me, many times there are parents whose child, disabled or otherwise, gets sick. Parent is fine, child is sick. Nobody is home to care for it. Something has to be put in place, especially for those with the disabled. I would almost say mainly for those with the disabled. That the parent can have sick leave benefits when they have to stay home from work, with proof, of course, to look after their child who is ill and cannot go to school, or they don't have anybody to look at them. Of course, with as I said, evidence, because you really don't want anybody abusing the system. But some, I will say us, but I meant to say some of them actually write sick leave certificates so that the parent can stay home. Sports, I'm looking forward to hear the honorable member responsible for that ministry in terms of what we are doing for the differently able, the disabled community. Overseas, this is something that is revered. There are world-class athletes that are disabled and doing well. Where is the push in Barbados? I would like to see athletics, whether it be disabled or not, really given the backing. Jamaica is just doing well. They recognize that this is a source of income for people. But in this forum now, I'm interested to hear what is happening, what is new, what pushes we are giving to those with disabilities. Madam Deputy Speaker, that brings me to the end of my contribution. I want to say that I wholly support the resolution and look forward to the legislation. I thank you for your time, and I will take my seat now.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it's fitting, coming after the last speaker, who is a medical doctor, that I also lend my voice to some of the issues that have been raised. But before I begin, I want to, first of all, congratulate the Honourable Minister, Member for St. Michael South, for his leadership in this area and certainly in the wider social care protection sector. It is, I don't think, lost on anybody that a lot of these policies that we've been bringing to this House that are seeking to protect the most vulnerable have to be led, have to have persons who get up every day to be able to push officers, to be able to meet with stakeholders, to be able to engage and to make sure that we're delivering on the things that we have said, not only in our manifestos, but that we continue to say as a government. And so I really want to congratulate him and all of the persons who would have worked on this. And I believe the Honourable Member for St. James North as well has to be truly commended, not only for the work that he has done in relation to the Commission, but I recall, Madam Deputy Speaker, being in opposition at a time when The honourable member was taunted and teased for his slight disability speaking by members of the then government. And perhaps that has motivated and encouraged him to fight for persons with disabilities and people who may be different or differently able. But I saw firsthand the taunting that took place and the way he had to fight back at times because of the way in which the behavior on the other side, and I know, ma'am, you know very well of what I speak, but he was able to rise above the criticisms and the taunting to be able to go on under this administration as a government to ably represent persons who are different, who are differently abled, and to be able to work with all of the stakeholders on the commission in order to ensure that we are able now today, on a very significant day, to be able to speak in this place about persons with disability and the formulation of a policy that will help to transform the lives of ordinary Barbadians. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have not gotten here overnight. And again, I recall being in opposition, and I think it was when, on the eve of the 2018 election, when the amendments were made to the Road Traffic Act at the time, where there was provision for persons to be penalized for parking in parking spaces designated for persons with disabilities. Some of the same faces that I saw proudly sit here today are some of the same faces I saw back then as well, who championed a lot of the changes that we have seen over the course of the last few years. There are also persons, Madam Deputy Speaker, who are not with us, who have also been the champions and the advocates in the sector, trying to make sure that the voice of those who have the ability to make and to effect change, that they will listen, that they start to see people, ma'am, and to ensure that not only do we see them, but we also hear them as well, and most importantly, that as a government, that we are also able to act and to ensure that we do better for the lives of ordinary Barbadians. We pledge our support for this sector, these individuals who, for the most part, you will hear almost every member speak on this side, certainly about persons who, whether in a professional capacity, whether in a personal capacity, they can share the experiences of persons with disabilities. And sometimes when I speak of philosophy, Madam Deputy Speaker, I speak of it from a perspective that these are the things that influence us as a government, the shared experiences that we have, the personal experiences, the reasons why we are passionate about particular areas, because we ourselves have been impacted in some way. And it goes further than just being a representative of people, but all of us, and I can speak openly, ma'am, we are affected, whether it is by children with autism. Many of us are affected by parents with dementia. Madam Deputy Speaker, you know better than anybody of what I speak. And we therefore have a level of, I think, empathy and sympathy in terms of the things that we must do in order to reverse a lot of what has now happened over the course of the last few years. I believe the Barbados Labour Party had started with a document called Include Me BIM, which was a call to action several years ago. And that has, for the most part, been our foundation in shaping the direction that we have chosen to go in terms of this establishment of the commission, the meeting with the various stakeholders, ensuring that we now move in a direction of having legislative policy to really back and to shape this particular framework of what we are discussing today. It is unfortunate, as I listen to the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, his comments regarding, while supporting the legislation, he alluded to the fact that, it was almost like he was colliding with this subject area for the first time. And it is quite unfortunate, Madam Deputy Speaker, but also given when he crossed the floor, the positions that were taken and the comments that were made by people with disabilities within Christchurch South, it perhaps is also not surprising that he does not understand the impact that persons who are affected with disabilities encounter. Because I recall a lady by the name, I think it was Lucille, indicating that she walked up and down for the Honourable Member, Madam Deputy Speaker. She is now an amputee and had heard nothing from the Honourable Member for some time. Of course, that is the cry of many others in Christchurch South, but I say that to say that I could see his pain in trying to not only support, but certainly to relate to a lot of what was said here today. And I hope that, sometimes they say a little learning is a dangerous thing, but I hope that the framework of what has been explained, certainly by all honorable members who spoke, has been able to give him a context in terms of the direction that certainly this administration intends to go in supporting a framework for persons with disabilities. He is correct that the last administration and the party he now leads would have supported the appointment to the Senate of the former president of the Senate, who is visually impaired. And all of us have supported those initiatives where we empower persons who traditionally would not have been elevated to such positions, but that is because philosophically this administration takes the view that we cannot select only persons either from our political party, but rather that we are here to build a Barbados for all. And all means people with disabilities, people who are differently able, people who do not look like us. We are here to make sure that we improve the lives and make lives better for all Barbadians. And so today I think is a very special day. I spoke to a number of the persons who were here in the public gallery from the disabled community earlier. Many of them expressed the sentiments that my colleagues have spoken to, where they have alluded to the fact that this is a great day for them. It is a long day in coming, but it is a day which has given them hope, because despite how long it has taken to make all the transformational changes that we are seeing taking place, the fact is that they have been a part of the process, and every significant achievement is a milestone for them to certainly to celebrate. I know that obviously, and last night when we had our parliamentary group meeting, as the Honourable Member for St. Michael South said, I was indicating to colleagues that while there will always be things that we all want to see change in relation to the policy for persons with disabilities, the reality is that this administration cannot run from the fact of its record. And at the end of the day, sometimes I suspect that we forget we have a record and a legacy upon which we should speak to and which we ought to speak to. Because I think sometimes we get so caught up in the criticism of the things that we have not yet done that sometimes we forget to pause and to remind ourselves and the country as to the strides that we have made. I think there's a total consensus across the board that we would love everything to move faster. We would love everybody to be able to be satisfied in accomplishing all the things that they want, and to make sure that persons with disabilities have all the provisioning that they would want. But I'm also mindful, and I think my colleagues are aware, that we still have, over the course of the last few years, made significant changes. And I'll speak to a few of them, Madam Deputy Speaker, because particularly in my ministry, Ministry of Public Works, from the time I became minister, I would have attended a special function in the city of Bridgetown, where this administration would have worked with the National Disabilities Unit and others to be able to identify a number of parking spaces. I think we reserved about 4 parking spaces in the city. That, I think, as you've heard, has made a significant difference for persons who have disabilities, who are able now whether to park or to have someone park in that area to facilitate them doing business in and around Bridgetown. And it is our hope, certainly within the ministry, that in working with them, we can continue to be able to identify additional spaces across all of the city centers as well, so that Bridgetown is not that only place where it takes place, but that you start to see the evolving of other spaces across the country where additional parking spaces are also demarcated. I shared with them this morning that I was at the licensing authority in the Pine just a few days ago, and we were trying to look at the issues that many persons in the public have expressed in relation to their interface between Barbados Licensing Authority and the BRA office in the Pine. And in looking at this space, I recognize, yes, we have ramps to allow persons to enter the BRA office. There's soon going to be a space allocated right next door, which is going to be a customer care center for the Barbados Licensing Authority. That also has a ramp as well on the other side. But the connecting door, which we are about to open, has some steps. And we spent probably about an hour and a half in discussions with the architects, the entire team, trying to figure out how we could facilitate and ensure that a person who comes to the Barbados Licensing Authority, for instance, for validation, for licensing, that they are able to move seamlessly to a cashier within the same space, and that they would not have to go outside of the building and walk around the other side by Bra in order to be able to transact business and to pay at the Barbados Revenue Authority. And in that moment, Madam Deputy Speaker, I realized that I too had become a disciple for persons with disabilities, because while we had no statistics to say at that point how many people were coming to the Bra office that they encountered on a daily basis with disabilities, what I understand clearly as my mission is that I am not catering for what is alone, but what it is the Barbados that I want it to be. And the one thing I understand philosophically in this political party is that we have a responsibility to create a Barbados for everybody, including persons with disabilities. And therefore, while we do not have that influx of persons now, it is my hope that with the new reconfiguration of the space, that we are able not only to benefit other Barbadians who complain about the pace at which things may move with BRA and Barbados Licensing Authority, but that persons who are within the disabled community will have the opportunity as well to move seamlessly from one location to the next. We also took a tour of Old Town, for instance. As many of you know, we're moving at some point to have a new civic center in the Old Town area. We looked at the BRA and Barbados Licensing Authority spaces. And the public needs to appreciate that even to find the space down there in the first place was a challenge. To place both offices in that location. And they're not connecting as they're about to do in the Pine. But what we were trying to do is to find a more seamless way, again, that not only everybody else can access it, but also persons with disability would be able to move seamlessly in this space. I say that, Madam Deputy Speaker, to again reinforce the point that we have all as ministers, because of the work of the Honourable Member for St. James North, the Honourable Member for St. Michael South, and all of the people who advocate. As ministers, we have become more sensitive to the issues at hand, and we understand that incrementally we have to make changes within our ministries to facilitate everybody and to give access to all. And that is really what I think is going to motivate now when we are building out new environments, new buildings. For instance, the new civic center, there obviously has to be an intention, a willful intention to ensure that the spaces not only have disabled parking, but also that there is an ease and flow of access for persons who are using the facilities. Now, we have the luxury now when we are creating new buildings, whether housing, whether commercial facilities, to ensure that under our planning laws that we're able to take people with disabilities into account, that we have elevators in some cases, that we also, instead of stairs in a building 3 or 4 stories up, that we also have adequate parking which is near to the entrance to the facility. We have that luxury now because we are seeking to transform and to build out a society. But here's the reality. Many of our existing structures, we've come and found them. And we are having to retrofit and to spend significant sums of monies in some cases to make it accessible for everyone. And I think people have to place what the demands are in a context as well, because we can't change every single place within society, every commercial location or every ministry. But what we can do is incrementally start to make the transition that persons with disabilities can have, just as we advocate for others, can have an ease of doing business and an access to the social services as well. In the Ministry of Public Works, we have also, as you would have heard, when we introduced the electric buses, 59 electric buses a few years ago, we ensured that they would facilitate wheelchair access. That also that they could lower themselves down to the driver can lower it to the curb, what do you call it, kneeling, in order to be able to allow a smooth transition from the sidewalks into the buses. When I was in China earlier this year, because I think colleagues are well aware and the public is well aware that the Prime Minister has been able to secure a donation of 30 buses from the People's Republic of China. we were able to indicate to the Chinese the specifications that we would want to see on the buses, and to indicate that we wanted some additional, them to be equipped not only with the wheelchair lifts, but also that we would also like to see the additional stop signals in the bus. I think initially there were 4, then they moved to 8 in the next set of buses that we brought, and we are advocating now for at least 12 stop signals to be placed within the bus. The other request that we'd made is for there to be an audible messaging to persons who are hearing impaired, to be able to tell them when a new stop is coming as well. So we've been exploring that with them, and hopefully they will be able to modify the buses to allow persons who are hearing impaired to also be able to, visually impaired, to also be able to see the signage indicating that a new stop is coming as well. So those are things that we've taken on board at the ministry. Just as I was sat here this morning, we received correspondence from the People's Republic of China confirming that they are ready to go to production. Foreign Affairs and Ministry just has to sign off the last set of documentation, and therefore we anticipate that by next year we will be in a position to land another 30 buses here in Barbados, which will no doubt ease the pressure for the disabled community, but I do believe it will ease the pressure for all Barbadians who have been requesting of us these things. We have also not only done the parking spaces, but we have also looked at the issue of sidewalks. I think somebody mentioned it earlier. We recognize that in some cases, again, because we are using what is existing, and that there needs to be some level of audit to be able to determine the nature of the work that has to be done to complement what has already been done, because we have seen under the new standards that there have been a number of sidewalks that are being built to be able to accommodate wheelchair access. A number of our buildings have the access for wheelchairs, but there are still very narrow streets, narrow sidewalks, where it is difficult because of the already existing infrastructure. In other words, a street light in the middle of the road, or a drain that has been open, or grills that make it very difficult for us to reconfigure existing roads, particularly in the city areas. And so we're mindful of it. Of course, it may require us looking at making some roads one way in order to be able to provide better access on the sidewalks and to create sidewalks access. But I think people can appreciate that all of what we would like to do also has a price tag, and therefore we have to again work incrementally to be able to maybe hit the things that are low-hanging, while at the same time trying to obtain financing to do some of the bigger things. I'm also pleased that I can report to the country as well that, and this impacts the persons with disabilities as it does all Barbadians, that the pilot project that we are working on to clean up the highways in and around the bus stops, in and around the roadways, both in the rural and the urban corridor. We have gotten that off the ground this week, and we're starting to clean the sides of the roads to make it easier, not just for pedestrians, but also for road users to be able to traverse. And I'm grateful to all of the teams that have been working on the ground to be able to do this. We recognize, even as we are doing it, that a lot of the overgrowth of bush has been presenting challenges, as we heard earlier as well, in relation to persons in wheelchairs having to avert oncoming traffic. And so over the course of the next few weeks, the country will certainly see the further rollout of those teams across the island. It is a new model that we are using. Rather than us engaging persons within MTW, we're seeking persons who have the capacity and the personnel to be able to engage persons that are involved in landscaping, to be able to clear a lot of the areas across the country, and of course being compensated by the Ministry of Transport and Works. And we feel very strongly that, again, this helps persons at bus stops, whether it's women, persons with disabilities. This has an impact not just on one community, but I believe it has the potential to impact the lives of all Barbadians and people who traverse. Even the caretaker who is going home on an evening from looking after somebody with a disability has the potential to be impacted by this particular program. And so we hope that we can sustain this, where we have ordinary Barbadians helping the Ministry of Transport and Works to be able to alleviate a lot of the overgrowth of bush across the country, with them being responsible for particular stretches of road and being responsible, therefore, as caretaker for cleaning drains and also for ensuring that we plant cuscus grass or that we plant shrubbery to ensure that the place is totally clean. Now, we therefore have also instituted some audible equipment at some signalized junctions, which is, I believe, at Fairchild Street, Pobin Street Junction, Highway 7, it was called the Reckless Road Junction, Codrington Road, White Hill, and the Spooner Hill Junction. And plans are in place for the next financial year for us to be able to look at some additional audible equipment to be able to assist, again, persons who are with disabilities. I know Senior Minister will probably speak to this when he speaks next week on this, but just to mention that in terms of standards, obviously, the standards currently for planning entail that wheelchair access is obviously a requirement for any of the new structures that are being constructed. And one of the things that it was mentioned to me today is that as we build out these environments, obviously the lowering of counters for persons with disabilities also is something that has to be front of mind. And this is not a government thing alone. This is something that I'm saying because I think, as others have spoken to, we need to be talking about these things so that as even private persons build out facilities that will require access of persons with disabilities, that they are also sensitized to the types of things that you have to take into account. We have also approved the increase in the fine for parking in a disabled space. Initially, it was $500 back in 2017, and this administration has taken the views of the disability sector, the National Disabilities Unit, into consideration, and they have advocated very heavily for an increase in the fines. The Honourable Member for St. James North, the Honourable Member for St. Michael's South, we have all been in serious discussions regarding the level of the penalty, because it seems as though there are persons out there who, despite seeing the clearly demarcated space for persons with disabilities, decide that they will disregard the need to ensure that those persons are adequately provided for. And basically, we have determined that a fine of around $5,000 would be perhaps a better deterrent. That paper is, I think, now before the Ministry of Finance, and so those offenders, I think, need to be put on notice that this administration takes this very seriously. We have about 20,000 persons, I believe, that we have indicated are persons with disabilities, but the reality is that we have also an aging population, and in our aging population, we are also finding that there are several other people who are developing disabilities in later life as well, and therefore this is not a policy that we can put in place for the now, but it is something that needs to be ingrained in people's minds from now to let them understand that this is a serious issue which is impacting our various communities and certainly persons who have disabilities. Madam Deputy Speaker, I spent a few years in education, and I have this saying, once a Minister of Education, always a Minister of Education. I was indicating the parliamentary group last night and the Honourable Minister that while there are still inroads to be made in education, and I totally support all of what has been recommended in the document, when I became Minister of Education, I recall the request being made by a number of parents to be able to have additional time. I also recall the request for larger print to be used by some children, because obviously in terms of visual impairment, some children needed to have larger print in order to be able to conduct their exams. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have raised a child who is high functioning, autistic, diagnosed with Asperger's, and I'm well aware of the challenges that children face in being able to communicate, in being able to employ a number of social skills, and to be able to pass an exam under the pressure that comes from having the challenges that they have. And therefore, as minister, I was very empathetic to persons in the public schools in particular who raised these issues about extra time. A number of the other programs at private school, International Baccalaureate and those others, they take these things into account. And so within the first few years, what we did was we increased the time once the persons were able to make the case with the appropriate recommendation from the doctors. I hear that in the report, I note that they're indicating that they would like additional time. My understanding, it was that it was being given based on the nature of the case. And I would want the Honourable Minister to just certainly speak with the Minister of Education to ensure that what was put in place is still obtaining today, because I know that we made that provision to allow persons to be able to have the additional time and the additional facilitation to be able to allow them not to be put under any more pressure than needed to be, but to ensure that they were in a position to feel comfortable sitting an exam. And why, Madam Deputy Speaker? Because many children need the support. They need the support whether in the classroom, they need the support whether through their parents in terms of the financial support, they need the support with the therapist, they need the support with all kinds of things in order to be able to excel if you have a disability. And I felt that whatever we could do to help to facilitate our children in education, to be able to make it easier for them to be able to cope with their condition, then that was a responsibility certainly for me as minister and certainly for the wider administration. And so I know that the underpinning of the philosophy is there. I think that the ministries just need to speak to be able to expand the request that has been made by the persons with disabilities to ensure that the children are not disadvantaged. I have seen personally the impact that support, whether financial or otherwise, can have on children who have a disability, wherever they are on the spectrum. It makes a difference when a parent is able to afford to support their child. And it also makes a difference when a parent is not able to provide the necessary, whether financial or other support for a child. And I certainly will always be an advocate in this administration for any policy which is going to either widen the net to be able to allow persons to be able to benefit from financial assistance where they have children who have disabilities, or whether it is adults who require additional assistance in order to be able to benefit from the provisioning of assistance in whatever form, whether medical or otherwise. I'm pleased that the Minister spoke earlier regarding other initiatives that are on the table. And I look forward to those and support those, as I said, because I do feel that we can no longer not see people who have disabilities, but rather because we are being affected in our own lives by persons who are deeply connected to us as well, that we have a responsibility to recognize that we too may be impacted in some way, because there are many politicians who have died with disabilities. They were the greatest and the brightest and the strongest in this chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker, but just like anybody else, they fall prey to issues of disability over their lifetime as well. And so we have to not only plan for today, but I feel very strongly that we have to plan for tomorrow as well in terms of the policies that we create in education and certainly in being able to cater to persons. I agree with the teaching of sign language. I know I have a community center in the Golden Rock area, and we used to have sign language classes for the children. Why? Because I felt that there were a number of persons in the community who suffered with disabilities, and it was important that we teach tolerance amongst our young population. As I think the Honourable Leader of the Opposition alluded to, we've had a situation in our society where people are shunted, people are You know, you hear about a person who lives in a household who has a disability, but you never see them. And we want to get to a point in this society where people are seen. People are not just, you don't just know that the person exists, but you also see the person existing, and that our children in particular are more tolerant of others that are different. You know, I remember when I was going through breast cancer, you know, having no hair, I felt like a person with a disability. And I could relate to persons who are different, because for that first period in my life, you know, you had long hair, and then all of a sudden you have no hair, and you know, I had locks, yes. And you know, it was a transition, but it was also a teaching moment in terms of what people who are different, people who have challenges, have to go through. And that's why I speak of the empathy that I think members on this side have in terms of understanding what people from the disabled community would want us to do. The beauty, though, of overseas is that, you know, you can have pink hair, you can have broken limbs, you can have whatever disability, and you are fully integrated into, you know, other countries, other developing countries. I think that is an ideal that we must aspire to, where everybody feels that they can be a part of the society. We see it in terms of our thinking, in terms of whether discrimination in all forms. And I think that that is something that we must continue to strive for, where there is that level of equality in the way in which we deal with our people. Special needs training as well, Madam Deputy Speaker, is something that, my view is that special needs training should be the general rule as opposed to the exception. I know that the Barbados Labour Party had done, and certainly under you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the leader of this party, when as in the Ministry of Education, would have spent a lot of time ensuring that teachers were trained in special needs education. There was a long period, no matter all the old talk that we hear this morning about who put where and who did what, there was a long period in education where the special needs area was neglected. The issue of diagnostic testing was neglected. Being able to know from the earliest age whether a child going through the Children's Development Center or going into a day nursery had the red flags that they were likely to develop a condition later on that would lead to a disability. A lot of that had been done away with. And we ask ourselves why we are here today talking about these things. We're here because some people didn't understand the mission. They didn't understand the holistic approach that was needed in terms of catering for all and not just catering for some. And we have had incrementally, and I'm sure the Honourable Acting Minister will speak to that next week when she speaks in this debate, about the things that are being done presently in the transformation on education to ensure that we start to test our children earlier. Because it is only with the early testing that we're able to identify what resources, even as a country, what resources as finance ministry will require in order to cater for the next generation of people as well. I remember visiting the day nursery in the Pine recently, and it was the transition for the little ones going into primary school. And it was so interesting that within, and I don't know if I have a special gift, but I know that within the first 5 minutes of being in this space, in speaking to the sister, I could point out the children who I could see had potential challenges. And the joke of it, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that when we discussed it, she asked me how it is that I could tell. But it is from dealing with children over the years. You can see the children who are acting out. They're somewhere on the spectrum. They're a little hyper. Sometimes you can see the deformities. You can see them from an early age. The truth is that some parents are in denial. Some parents, on the other hand, are also parents who don't know where to turn for the help. And I think that we, in all of our messaging on this policy, one of the most important things for the Honourable Minister and his team is going to be the sensitization and the education of people generally about people with disabilities. What to look for, what to do if you discover that your child has a disability. Don't just tell the child may be bad behaved. Don't just tell the child, there's nothing that you could do. We need to be able to provide those support systems for our families and also for our children. We've done exceptionally well in terms of recent announcements on the non-contributory pensions. And I think we need to continue along that vein, but we also need people to come forward so that we can collect the data to help inform the decision-making in this particular sector as well, because 20,000 is not a number that I think any of us can ignore, certainly. I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this policy signals to the disabled community an attempt by this administration that it is prepared to follow through on what it has said it will do. I think that it is a recognition too that even in the way that we treat the persons who go to the hospital who are determined that they are disabled because they may have been involved in an accident or their health condition has required now that they are determined that they're under a disability. I think we have to look at the way in which the social services department at the hospital also does the assessments, because I don't think it is enough just to tell a person that they may need additional help. I think we are now at that point where we have to work closer with the agencies to ensure that we quickly assess the households, determine what support is actually needed within the whole households, both financial and otherwise, and to have mechanisms in place to ensure that that person with a disability or child is able to be adequately catered for. I think too often, the system presently does not permit for serious cases where there's significant sums of monies for children to benefit from care, to be able to obtain that care. And I recall having a conversation with a doctor where I was left feeling as though the lives did not matter, that lives had a price tag. Because I was told on one occasion of a child very sick, but who had outlived the expectations of the hospital and the doctors in terms of their medical condition, that there was nothing more that could be done, that the child is going to die regardless because it has this disability, and therefore there's only a limited amount of monies available for us to be able to cover certain expenses, and without saying it, essentially saying that some lives matter more than others. And I want to say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I feel that while I understand and appreciate that we have limited funds, I do feel that greater effort can be made, particularly with the private sector and also with the international organizations, and more importantly, by our diaspora, because there are several people I encounter in the medical community who are Bajans that want to find a way to give and to give back. And they just need that mechanism to be able to identify what are the things sometimes that Barbados needs, what are the things within facilities that are needed, what are the things that individuals need. I spent the last 48 hours compiling a list of things for my constituents, which I consider to be necessary for whether it's persons with disabilities, elder care, or even cancer care. From hospital beds to the pagers, where persons might be in one room and the person who is caring for them they want to press to tell the person that they need support so that they can press it so that they are not in distress and they're not able to call out for somebody. I've looked at things, ma'am, that relate to wheelchair accessibility, walkers that have the seats that the persons can sit in, grip bars that you can put in a shower, grip bars you can put within the bathroom to help them to be able to lift themselves up from the toilet, rests that will allow them to support as toilet seat raisers that people need as they get older, the knees are failing, and they need something a little higher so that when they bend down, they're able to be comfortable, ma'am. These are the areas, these are the practical things that this administration, certainly the Ministry and the Disabilities Unit, need to look at and to be able to implore on others to be able to identify some of these things that can be sent back to Barbados, that can meet the needs of the aging population and the disabled population. And I think that that needs to be a serious pilot that is done here. I can do it for my constituents, ma'am. I can do it for persons who reach out to me. But I feel that the time has now come, particularly with us being so much more aware of elderly issues as well as persons with disabilities, and the combination of the two, that we need to retrofit houses and to enable people to get things that can retrofit their homes. I have had to do it personally for my own father. I did it for my grandmother. I do it for people on a regular basis. And I always make the comment in this place about persons, elderly persons, persons in housing units, how we have to have a policy that allows us to address the retrofitting of these homes that are no longer fit for purpose. Persons who are getting older, persons with disabilities who cannot maneuver the stairs to go up to their bedroom. We need to have clear policy as to how we deal with those individuals. I've made the suggestions before. We need to get to the point where we implement a number of those things. Because while we build out and we make provision for persons who are coming on board to rent or to mortgage properties, the reality is that there are still people, a large percentage of people, who are living with disabilities in a number of these houses that are not fit for purpose. And we may need to also look at elder care facilities within households in communities. I'm not talking about geriatric nursing homes, sorry. I'm talking about individuals who already, to some extent, love looking after old people, love to help persons with disabilities, and where we are able as a government to have a policy where we help them to retrofit their homes following specific guidelines where they can take in 2, 3, or 4 persons and care for them under specific guidelines. People do it informally. You know, everybody's not going to get into the hospitals wherever they are, whether geriatric, specialized facilities, they're just not going to have enough resources. But we have enough people in communities who still care about people and care about providing this type of care. And while I know the Honourable Minister is looking, and Cabinet, we've looked at the facilitating for the build-out of additional facilities, I feel very strongly that this type of model would allow us to get the uptake faster while we build out the structures. Because while we building is 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line by the time all the planning permissions and the tendering and everything happens. But if we can have a system for being able to care for persons within communities, encourage people to create activities, get the NGOs to be able to work on programs, specialized programs to deal with the care of persons with disabilities and the elderly man, I believe that we will start to see us turning the corner, because there must be a belief that government alone cannot do everything. Government alone cannot build everything. And therefore, what we have to find out is, what do we need? And once we know what we need, then we need to implore on the people out there, whether both here or outside, who have either the resources or the ideas to be able to offer those services to the general population, even if we as a government or ministry subsidize some of the costs of so doing. I recall we have a call and ride system, for instance, where we take students to school. And one of the biggest concerns is the lack of adequate bus service. I've started to explore, ma'am, looking at, because I don't like the fact that little children can't get to school, especially children who have disabilities. I think that we are denying them a basic human right, and it is our responsibility as a government to make sure that we're able to provision, either by government purchasing the vehicles and allowing it to fall within our transportation system, or being able to create the environment where persons who are interested in providing the service can be facilitated, whether with duty-free concessions or otherwise, to supply the service and government pay for the subsidized care. We can't keep talking about it. We got to get to the point now where I think we put in place the provisioning, whether private sector or government, to be able to ensure that these children get to school. That has to be complemented by new ways of teaching within the school system, where there may be the blended approach. Some children can learn in the classroom. Some classrooms are set up for children to be able to learn remotely. But we have to start somewhere, and perhaps we may have to start with the persons outside of the school system sometimes who are already doing these things, but they're doing them for persons who have the means to be able to pay for these services. I am a firm believer that whatever I see in private institutions is possible for children attending a public institution in this country. And there is no reason why the private sector and the people who have money have been able to cater for their children, to provide additional support persons in the households, to provide additional support in the schools. And for some reason, we've not been able to get it quite right. And I humbly suggest that that time has come, particularly while this policy is fresh, for us to have that sit down to determine how can we make this make sense for people. Because all of what we've talked about, building out facilities and all of those things, those are long term. But the things that I believe we must be commended for is, for instance, the assistance to the Autism Association. Let the people and the parents who know about raising children with disabilities be encouraged to establish facilities to cater for their children and for children like them. Because you will get more out of them because of the dedication that they have and the understanding that they have about the conditions. It is not to say that government can't do it or that we aren't doing bits of it. But I recall too becoming minister and discovering that, you know, some of the children, there were a number of children who were to be placed in special needs institutions. And we just simply don't have enough spaces. We don't have enough spaces to accommodate all of the children who are on the waiting list. And this minister at the time, ma'am, made sure that where we could pay, just like you do a bursary, where we could pay for children to be able to go to specialized institutions, private institutions, we paid for them to be able to go, ma'am. And I believe that that approach is a better approach than having a child sitting at home for 3, 4, 5 years on a waiting list and not being accommodated. Lastly, ma'am, on the issue of education, I want to also mention the Alma Parish School has been completed. Let it not be uttered that we have not delivered on that. When I left as minister, that was one of the things. It was in process. The school has been completed, and the cabinet has reviewed with the current minister a proposal for how we will address the Alma Parish School. But I am proud to say, ma'am, that all of the amenities that are required for a school to be able to help children with different disabilities on the spectrum were provided in that institution, because we understood where the need was as a government and certainly as a ministry, where the need was and what we had to cater for if we were going to build out new institutions. And so I think we have started the process of being able to embrace, but the truth is there are too many children that sometimes are on that waiting list, that are in schools that are not properly being catered for. This is real talk. This is our reality. And we have to now find a way to encourage, while we are building out and doing all the transformation, to be able to encourage persons to build out or to pay for our students to be accepted into, whether it's private institutions, where we maybe pay for a teacher. In some cases, that's what we did at the ministry. Pay for a teacher to go into an institution so that they can support the children who had special needs. You can't be training teachers and then not deploying them to teach children who are special needs children. So we have done a lot, but I think the time has now come where we need to stop talking, and we don't need the more data. I think it is clear what the issues are, and I think we now need to pretty much make sure that the various agencies are aligning and that we start incrementally. I do not believe that we are going to be able to do everything all one time, but we must start the process of beginning to make this transformation incrementally. And I look forward certainly to the Alma Parish School welcoming the first cohort of students when the plans are in place for that in the near future, to be able to ensure that we're able to cater to students with particular learning disabilities as well. So, ma'am, I wish to support this resolution, and again to congratulate the minister as well as the chairman of the committee and all who have served. I hope that this is a moment that not only the persons who have disabilities appreciate the journey that we have traveled to be able to get here, but I look forward with the leadership of both honourable members being able to work with them as a government to be able to deliver on the promises that this administration has made to persons with disabilities. I'm obliged.
Honourable Member Simpson North East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Member Simpson North East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
right, ma'am, I know the day has been a long one. I really want to express gratitude to the persons who would have come from the disabilities community to be able to sit with us today. I know it has been rough on them, but we really appreciate your presence and certainly the support that has been offered. And therefore, I would wish to suspend this sitting suspend this sitting until next week, the 5th of November, for continuation of debate. Sorry, move further consideration of the resolution. And we adjourn the sitting until next week, the 5th of November.
For one. Sorry? A minute, he's saying something. He's saying something. Our members, the question is that further consideration of this resolution be postponed until honorable members, the honorable members who are in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the adjournment of the House until next Tuesday, the 5th of November.
The question is that this honorable chamber be adjourned until Tuesday, the 5th of November. Honorable members in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This honorable chamber is adjourned until the 5th of November at 10 a.m.